I walked into my freezing house after a 2-week business trip to find a yellow post. It note from my husband, slapped on the kitchen island. Deal with this senile old woman, it read. My mother and I are flying to Cabo. I froze your joint credit cards, so you have to use your own money to keep her alive. I found his grandmother locked in the freezing guest room, barely breathing. But when I reached for the phone to call for an ambulance, the dying woman grabbed my wrist with terrifying strength, her eyes suddenly crystal clear, and whispered, "Do not call them. Help me get revenge instead. They have no idea who I really am." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe to find out how that freezing night changed everything for my family and me. If you have ever had to stand up to entitled people who underestimated your worth, this journey is for you. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant. I spent my entire life building my career from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail to escape my working-class roots and establish a life of stability. I dragged my suitcase up the driveway of our sprawling Atlanta suburban home. I had just spent 2 grueling weeks in Chicago running a massive corporate audit. My days had been consumed by endless spreadsheets, hostile board members, and late nights fueled by stale diner coffee. All I wanted in the world was a hot shower and the comfort of my own bed. But the moment I unlocked the heavy oak front door of our house, a wave of freezing air hit me square in the chest. The thermostat had been completely shut off. It was mid-November, and the chill inside the house felt sharper than the wind outside. I dropped my bags in the grand foyer, my heels clicking sharply against the imported tile. Instead of the usual scent of vanilla diffusers and fresh laundry, a heavy, unmistakable stench assaulted my senses. It was the sour smell of stale urine mixed with rotting medication and neglect. The silence in the house was thick, heavy, and completely unnatural. I called out for my husband, Terrence. There was no answer. I walked into our pristine, custom-designed kitchen. Sitting dead center on the massive white marble island was a single yellow post-it note. The casual, sloppy handwriting belonged to my husband. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the ink, my exhaustion instantly evaporating into a cold, hard rage. Deal with this senile old woman. Mom and I are flying to Cabo for her birthday week. I froze your joint cards so you use your own money for her nurses. Do not call us. My blood ran ice cold. Terrence and his mother Vivian had always looked down on my background. They loved to remind me at every family dinner that their lineage was built on old money, a long line of affluent black excellence that I was supposedly lucky to marry into. Vivian constantly treated my career as a forensic accountant like it was some blue-collar joke, a dirty little hobby I did just to embarrass them. She wore designer gowns and hosted lavish charity galas, funding her lifestyle with money she claimed came from her late husband's brilliant investments. Terrence was cut from the exact same cloth. He was arrogant, entitled, and entirely reliant on family wealth he had never lifted a finger to earn. But locking down our shared accounts and leaving his own grandmother behind like discarded trash was a new level of depravity even for them. Terrence froze the joint accounts because he wanted to punish me. He resented my financial independence. He knew my moral compass would never allow me to let a human being suffer, so he weaponized my empathy. He wanted me to drain my own hard-earned savings to clean up his mess while he sipped expensive margaritas on a beach in Mexico. I crumpled the yellow note in my fist and threw it onto the floor. I sprinted down the long hallway toward the guest wing. The air grew significantly colder with every step I took. Terrence had intentionally turned off the heating zones for this specific side of the house to save a few dollars on the utility bill. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to the guest bedroom, and the smell hit me so hard I had to cover my mouth. The room was pitch black. I fumbled for the light switch, my heart hammering against my ribs. When the chandelier flickered on the sight made my stomach heave violently. Grandma Ruby was shoved into the furthest corner of the room. She was curled up on a thin mattress with no sheets, wearing a soiled cotton nightgown that offered absolutely no warmth. Her frail 82-year-old body was shivering violently. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from severe dehydration, and a single empty plastic cup sat on a tray, completely out of her reach. I rushed to her side, dropping to my knees on the freezing hardwood floor. I pulled off my heavy wool coat and draped it immediately over her fragile shoulders. Her skin was like ice. Her breathing was so shallow that her chest barely moved. Grandma Ruby had been living with us for the past year after Vivian claimed the old woman's mind was completely gone. Vivian loved to parade Ruby around at church luncheons and high society country club dinners to play the role of the devoted, sacrificing daughter-in-law. She would stand at the podium dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, soaking up the praise and sympathy from their wealthy social circle. But behind closed doors, the reality was sickening. Vivian and Terrence treated this woman like a burden. They were just waiting to expire. They ignored her calls for help, fed her cheap canned soup, and locked her away whenever they hosted their lavish dinner parties, so her presence would not ruin the aesthetic of their perfect lives. Now they had literally left her to freeze to death. I ran into the adjoining bathroom, turning on the faucet and soaking a clean washcloth in warm water. I hurried back to Ruby, gently pressing the warm cloth to her forehead and trying to squeeze a few drops of water onto her cracked lips. Anger, hot and blinding, surged through my veins. Terrence and Vivian were monsters hiding behind designer labels and church pews. I grabbed my cell phone from my back pocket, my fingers shaking as I unlocked the screen. I did not care about the frozen credit cards or the trip to Cabo. My only focus was keeping this woman alive. I brought the phone up fully prepared to dial for emergency services and have my husband arrested for elder abuse the second his plane landed. I paused for a fraction of a second before calling the police. I needed to give Vivian one final chance to justify this horror. My fingers were stiff from the freezing temperature of the room as I opened my contacts and pressed her name. The line rang exactly half a time before sending me straight to her customized voicemail greeting. Vivian's overly polished, sickeningly sweet voice echoed through the speaker, informing callers that she was currently unavailable and prioritizing family time. She was screening me. I could picture her perfectly. She was likely sitting in a first-class cabin right now, sipping a complimentary mimosa, rolling her eyes at my name, flashing on her screen, and then casually pressing the ignore button. I tossed the phone onto the edge of the mattress and grabbed a dry towel to wrap around Grandma Ruby's freezing feet. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. My muttered curses filled the silent, empty room. Vivian loved to publicly boast about her extensive charity work and her generous donations to the local church. Yet here was her own mother-in-law locked away and left to rot in the dark. Vivian had always treated my career as a crude joke. She called my work in forensic accounting a blue-collar obsession with other people's money. At her lavish country club dinners, she would introduce me to her wealthy friends as the girl who balances Terrence's checkbook. She deliberately stripped away my hard-earned credentials, ignoring the fact that I held a master's degree and unraveled complex financial fraud for major corporations. To Vivian, true success was inherited, never earned. She paraded around in custom designer gowns, bragging about the generational wealth left behind by her late husband. She acted as though her bloodline elevated her above the basic rules of human decency. Terrence was exactly the same. He walked through Atlanta society as a brilliant tech entrepreneur. But I knew the truth. His startup was a financial black hole entirely propped up by the massive allowance Vivian funneled to him every quarter. They were a family of shiny, hollow shells completely devoid of empathy. And they expected me to clean up their ugly secrets while they maintained their flawless public image. I looked down at the frail woman trembling on the mattress. Her shallow breathing was growing fainter. The sheer cruelty of it all broke through my professional composure, replacing it with a cold, absolute fury. There was no more time for family politics. I did not care about the scandal this would cause. I did not care about the country club rumors or the inevitable divorce. I reached for my phone again. My hands were perfectly steady now. I opened the keypad and firmly tapped the numbers 911. My thumb hovered over the bright green call button. I took a deep breath, mentally preparing the exact statement I was going to give the emergency dispatcher. I was going to provide my address, request an ambulance, and explicitly state that I was reporting a severe case of elder abuse and intentional medical neglect perpetrated by my husband. I pressed the call button. The phone screen transitioned to the emergency dialing interface. The first long, hollow ring echoed from the speaker. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on my left wrist. I gasped, my entire body jerking backward in shock. I nearly dropped the phone. The grip was completely unnatural for a woman in her condition. It was not a weak, desperate fumble. It was a vice. The fingers digging into my skin were bone-crushing and intensely deliberate. I ripped my gaze away from the glowing screen and looked down at the bed. Grandma Ruby was no longer shivering. The terrifying frailty that had consumed her body just seconds ago had completely vanished. Her head turned sharply toward me. Her eyes, which had been clouded, vacant, and lost to dementia for the better part of a year, were suddenly wide open. The milky haze was entirely gone. They were not the eyes of a woman standing at death's door. They were crystal clear, incredibly sharp, and burning with an intense, calculating fire. Before I could even process the sheer impossibility of what I was witnessing, her other hand shot up. Her movements were shockingly fluid and rapid. She snatched the phone directly out of my grip. She tapped the red button instantly, killing the emergency call just as the dispatcher's voice began to crackle through the speaker. She tossed my phone onto the floor, the heavy device sliding away across the hardwood. I froze, completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in reality. My mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her spine straightened, adopting a commanding posture I had not seen her hold in over a decade. The sour smell of neglect still clung to her clothes, but the aura of helpless decay was entirely gone. She leaned in close to my face. When she spoke, her voice did not waver. It was not weak or raspy. It was as smooth and solid as polished steel. "Put the phone down, child. I am not dying, and I am not crazy." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over me in the freezing room. Her piercing gaze locked onto mine, stripping away every ounce of confusion and panic I had left. The corners of her mouth twitched into a small, terrifyingly sharp smile. "Help me get revenge. They have no idea who I really am." I stood completely paralyzed, staring at the woman who had just shattered my entire understanding of reality. Grandma Ruby swung her frail legs over the edge of the mattress. There was no hesitation in her movements. The violent trembling that had consumed her body just moments ago had stopped entirely. She reached down, grabbed the thin, soiled blanket, and tossed it onto the floor with a look of absolute disgust. She rubbed her arms, shivering, not from weakness, but from the genuine cold of the unheated room. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. My brain, trained to analyze complex financial data and seek logical patterns, completely misfired. This was the same woman I had watched drool into her oatmeal for the past 12 months. This was the woman Vivian claimed could not remember her own name or recognize her own reflection. "Do not look so shocked, Kendra," Ruby said, her tone sharp and commanding. I had to make it convincing. If I had broken character even once, Vivian would have shipped me off to a state-funded asylum the very next morning. She patted the empty space on the mattress next to her, signaling me to sit. I did not move. I was still processing the sheer magnitude of the deception. "You have been faking it," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. "For a whole year. You sat at the dinner table staring at the wall while Vivian treated you like a stray dog. You let Terrence lock you in this freezing room. Why would you subject yourself to that?" Ruby let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Because I needed to see the truth. I needed to know exactly who these people were when they thought nobody was watching, or rather when they thought the person watching had no brain left to comprehend their actions." She stood up, walking over to the frosted window and looking out at the dark driveway. "When my son passed away, he left Vivian with a generous fortune. But Vivian is a fool with money. She cares only about status country clubs and designer labels. Over the decades, I watched her bleed his legacy dry to maintain her ridiculous facade. And then I watched her pass that exact same entitlement down to Terrence." Ruby turned to face me, her eyes hardening into dark stones. A year ago, I noticed discrepancies in my primary checking and savings accounts. Small withdrawals at first, then larger wire transfers, signatures that looked like mine but felt forged. I knew it was Terrence and Vivian, but I needed absolute proof of their depravity. So I started forgetting things. I left the stove on. I called Terrence by his father's name. I let my eyes glaze over during conversations. And just like vultures, the moment they smelled decay, they swooped in. Once they secured medical power of attorney by paying off that crooked doctor of theirs, they went to work. Ruby continued, her voice dripping with venom. They drained what they believed was my entire life savings, every single penny I kept in those local accounts. $2.5 million, Kendra. Gone. Siphoned off to fund Terrence's failing tech company and Vivian's lavish charity galas. They stole from a woman they believed was completely defenseless. And once the accounts hit zero last week, I stopped being a source of income. I became a financial burden. That is why they locked me in this freezing room and flew to Mexico. They left me here hoping nature would take its course, saving them the cost of a nursing home facility. I shook my head, my mind racing through the legal implications. I need to call the police, I said firmly. If they stole $2.5 million, that is felony elder abuse and wire fraud. I am a forensic accountant. I can track the transfers. I can pull the bank records and prove it. But Ruby held up a hand, stopping me instantly. No police. Not yet. Putting them in jail for stealing a few million is not enough. I want them humiliated. I want their entire social empire burned to the ground. I want them to lose everything they value publicly and permanently. She walked closer to me, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. Terrence and Vivian think they took everything I have. They think they won. But they are arrogant, and arrogance breeds stupidity. My late husband knew exactly what kind of woman Vivian was. He knew she would eventually ruin our son and poison our grandson with her greed. Before he died, he and I set up a private, irrevocable blind trust. We transferred the vast majority of our wealth into it. We never told Vivian, we never told Terrence. We let them believe the local accounts were the entirety of our estate. How much, I asked, my professional instincts fully kicking in, overriding my shock. How much is in the trust? Ruby looked me dead in the eye, her posture radiating absolute authority. $45 million. And as of last month, the trust has matured and I am the sole uncontested beneficiary. I control every single dime. The number hit me like a physical blow. $45 million. Vivian was walking around Atlanta, acting like royalty, bragging about her generational wealth while actively bankrupting herself and stealing from an old woman she thought was broke. Terrence was freezing my credit cards to force me to pay for his grandmother's basic medical care, completely unaware that the woman he locked in a freezing guest room possessed enough capital to buy his entire tech startup 50 times over. The sheer audacity of their cruelty was matched only by their breathtaking ignorance. They think they bled me dry, Ruby said, a cold smile touching her lips. They think I am a useless, senile old bat waiting to die in the dark. But I am fully awake, Kendra, and I am incredibly angry. I have watched the way they treat you in this house. I have watched Vivian belittle your career and Terrence manipulate your finances. You are the only person in this family who actually works for a living. You have the exact skills I need. I need a forensic accountant to trace every single dollar they stole from my decoy accounts. I want a flawless paper trail of their fraud. When I drop the hammer on them, I want the evidence to be absolutely bulletproof. The freezing air in the room suddenly did not bother me anymore. A deep, satisfying warmth spread through my chest, pushing out the exhaustion of my business trip and the sting of Terrence's betrayal. For years, I had swallowed my pride. I had endured the insults, the condescension, and the emotional abuse just to keep the peace in my marriage. I had let them make me feel small. But looking at the fierce, brilliant woman standing before me, I knew the piece was officially over. The rules of engagement had just changed. I looked down at the crumpled yellow post-it note still lying on the floor, and then back up at Ruby. We had a lot of work to do. I pulled my phone back out of my pocket, ignoring the cracked screen from where it had hit the hardwood floor. We needed to move fast. Ruby was mentally sharp, but her physical body was still dangerously dehydrated and severely malnourished. Taking her to a standard emergency room was completely out of the question. A hospital would require her insurance records, notify her registered emergency contacts, and instantly alert Terrence and Vivian. I could not risk them rushing back to Atlanta to seize control of her medical care before we had our evidence secured. Fortunately, my years of conducting high-level corporate audits often brought me into contact with the discreet, off-the-book services utilized by the ultra-wealthy. I opened my private banking app on my phone and transferred a $10,000 retainer to a highly exclusive concierge medical group based in the Buckhead district. I requested their top physician and demanded absolute confidentiality. Within 45 minutes, a black luxury SUV pulled quietly into my driveway. Dr. Evans, a seasoned private physician who specialized in VIP care without a paper trail, stepped out carrying two heavy medical cases. I led him past the grand foyer and straight into the freezing guest wing. I had managed to drag a heavy space heater from my own bedroom to raise the temperature, but the room was still deeply uncomfortable. Dr. Evans asked zero questions. His silence and discretion were exactly what I had paid for. He quickly assessed Ruby, checking her blood pressure and listening to her heart. He immediately started an intravenous drip of saline, infused with essential vitamins and electrolytes, and then drew a comprehensive panel of blood work to check for any severe organ distress. As the clear fluid flowed steadily into her veins, the terrifying ashiness in Ruby's skin began to slowly fade. We spent the next 3 hours sitting together in that small room while the IV did its work. I briefed Dr. Evans on the strict parameters of our arrangement. He signed a cast-iron non-disclosure agreement I printed from my laptop, legally binding him to report his medical findings only to me. Ruby sat up against the pillows, the color returning to her cheeks and the frightening weakness finally leaving her limbs. While the doctor packed up his equipment, Ruby and I cemented our strategy. To the rest of the world, and especially to my husband, my mother-in-law, and the hired household staff, Ruby had to remain a babbling, bedridden ghost. She would continue to stare blankly at the walls. She would continue to pretend her memory was completely gone. But behind closed doors, when we were entirely alone, she was the general of our war. Once Dr. Evans slipped back out into the early morning darkness, I knew it was time to execute my part of the mission. I made sure Ruby was warm and comfortable under a thick down comforter, promising to check on her in an hour. Then I walked down the long hallway toward Terrence's private home office. The room was a sickening monument to his unearned ego. He had a massive mahogany desk, framed tech magazine articles he had paid a public relations firm to secure, and a customized triple-monitor computer setup that dominated the space. I sat down in his expensive leather executive chair and cracked my knuckles. Terrence always bragged at dinner parties about his state-of-the-art home server, claiming he designed the security encryption himself for his tech startup. But I knew my husband better than anyone. He was a raging narcissist, and narcissists are predictably lazy when they think nobody is smart enough to challenge them. I booted up the primary terminal. The login screen immediately demanded a complex biometric authentication and a 12-character password. I did not even bother trying to guess it. Instead, I bypassed his flashy front-end security entirely by accessing the network through the router's backdoor admin panel. It was a basic vulnerability I exploited all the time when investigating amateur corporate embezzlement rings. Within 10 minutes, I had bypassed his firewall and was staring directly at the root directory of Terrence's private financial server. I opened the accounting software and started pulling the very first batch of records. I was specifically looking for the routing numbers connected to the local decoy accounts Ruby had mentioned. The moment I hit the search key, the screen flooded with an overwhelming amount of data. I saw massive wire transfers disguised as vendor payments. I found offshore holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands and a complex web of dummy limited liability companies registered under Vivian's maiden name. The sheer volume of the fraud was staggering. They had not just stolen Ruby's $2.5 million. They had layered the stolen funds through a dozen different fake corporate entities to wash the money before dumping it into Terrence's failing business accounts. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I initiated a mass download transferring the encrypted ledgers directly to a secure external drive I always kept hidden inside the lining of my work briefcase. I needed every single receipt, every forged signature, and every digital timestamp. I was building a cage they would never be able to buy their way out of. Then the heavy silence of the office was shattered. My cell phone vibrated violently against the glass surface of the mahogany desk. The bright screen illuminated the dark room. I glanced down and saw Terrence's name flashing across the display. He was not calling me. It was a direct text message. I picked up the phone, my heart giving a hard thump against my ribs. The timestamp showed it was currently 4 in the morning in Cabo San Lucas. Terrence should have been passed out drunk in a luxury resort suite. I swiped the screen open and read the message. My security app says you are trying to access the estate servers. Stay in your lane and clean up the old bat's mess. I stared at Terrence's text message for exactly 2 seconds before I deleted it. I did not reply. I did not justify my actions. I simply finished downloading the encrypted ledgers onto my secure drive, wiped my digital footprint from his home server, and walked out of his office. Terrence was thousands of miles away on a beach in Mexico. He was completely powerless to stop what was already in motion. The sun was just starting to rise over the Atlanta suburbs when I finally managed to get a few hours of sleep. I woke up at 8 o'clock feeling a strange surge of adrenaline. I walked into the kitchen to brew a pot of coffee, checking the secure monitor connected to the temporary camera I had placed in the hallway outside the guest wing. Ruby was safely resting in the warm room, the IV fluids from the night before, having worked absolute miracles on her physical state. We had our secret alliance, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was holding the winning hand. I was just pouring my first cup of coffee when the loud screech of air brakes shattered the quiet morning. I walked over to the large bay window overlooking the front yard. A massive white commercial moving truck was backing up my pristine driveway, its heavy tires crushing the edges of our manicured lawn. 4 burly men wearing matching gray uniforms jumped out of the cab and began lowering the hydraulic ramp. And marching right behind them, holding a designer clipboard and wearing oversized sunglasses, was Megan. Megan was the wife of Terrence's younger brother. She was a 32-year-old white woman who spent every waking moment trying desperately to secure her position within this affluent black family. Her entire personality was constructed around mimicking Vivian. She copied Vivian's wardrobe, she parroted Vivian's elitist opinions, and most disgustingly, she eagerly participated in Vivian's cruel treatment of anyone they deemed beneath them. That included me, and it certainly included Grandma Ruby. Megan overcompensated in every interaction using racial microaggressions, masked as polite concern to keep me in my place. She did not even bother to ring the doorbell. She simply unlocked the heavy oak front door, using the spare key Vivian had given her, and marched into my foyer like she owned the property. Her heels clicked loudly and aggressively against the imported tile as she waved the 4 large moving men inside. "Right this way, gentlemen," she announced loudly, completely ignoring my presence in the kitchen. "We need to head straight down to the guest wing. We are clearing out all the heavy items today. Be careful with the paint on the walls." I set my coffee mug down on the marble island. The ceramic clinked sharply against the stone. Megan stopped in her tracks and finally looked in my direction. She pulled her oversized sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, offering me a tight, incredibly condescending smile. "Good morning, Kendra," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Vivian called me from Cabo late last night. She was extremely concerned about the living situation here. She said you were struggling to manage Ruby's rapid decline, so she authorized me to come over and clear out the junk in the guest room. We are going to make space for a proper hospice bed. You really should be thanking me. I am doing you a massive favor by taking this off your plate." I crossed my arms and stepped out of the kitchen, physically blocking the hallway that led to the guest wing. Megan was an absolutely terrible liar. Vivian did not care about a hospice bed, and Megan certainly did not wake up early on a Saturday to do manual labor out of the goodness of her heart. "There is no junk in that room, Megan," I said, my voice low and steady. "And you are not bringing 4 strange men into my house while my husband is away without my permission. Tell them to leave right now." Megan let out a dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes as she turned to the hired movers. "Just ignore her, boys," she instructed, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "She is just being emotional and uncooperative. Head down the hall, the first door on the left. The target is the antique mahogany dresser. Wrap it up carefully and load it onto the truck. Do not scratch my mother-in-law's floors." The 4 large men hesitated for a moment, looking back and forth between me and Megan. They could clearly sense the hostility in the room. "I said move!" She snapped, her fake sweet tone instantly dissolving into shrill entitlement. "I am paying you by the hour to do exactly what I say." The men started walking toward the hallway. I did not back down. I stepped directly into the center of the corridor, planting my feet firmly against the hardwood. I looked the lead mover dead in the eye. "If you take one single step past me into the private wing of my home, I will call the police and have all 4 of you arrested for breaking and entering," I said, my voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. "I am the legal homeowner. This woman does not live here. She has no legal right to authorize the removal of any property from this premises. If you touch anything in that room, you will be charged with grand larceny." The lead mover stopped immediately. He put his hands up in a gesture of surrender and took a step back, signaling the other 3 men to do the same. They were professionals, and they were not paid enough to deal with wealthy suburban domestic disputes or threats of police involvement. Megan's face turned a violent shade of red. She stomped her foot against the tile. "You are being completely ridiculous and aggressive, Kendra," she yelled, pointing a finger right at my face. "You do not understand how this family operates. Vivian gave me explicit orders. That mahogany dresser is an ugly, worthless piece of junk taking up space. It needs to go to the dump today." I stared at her, my analytical mind connecting the dots with terrifying speed. Megan was a vicious social climber who only cared about brand names and flashy new money aesthetics. She had never shown a single ounce of interest in antiques or family history. And yet she had rushed over here early in the morning, hired an expensive professional moving crew, and specifically targeted a single heavy wooden dresser inside the bedroom of a woman she thought was actively dying. She was not here to clean. She was not here to help make room for medical equipment. She was here on a highly targeted retrieval mission. Vivian had sent her to get something hidden inside that specific piece of furniture. Something they urgently needed to possess before Ruby passed away, and something they absolutely did not want me to find first. "You are not taking the dresser, Megan," I said, stepping closer to her, forcing her to take a step back toward the front door. "And you are not taking anything else. You have exactly 10 seconds to get out of my house before I have you escorted off the property." I stared at the small brass key resting in the palm of her hand. The weight of what it represented was absolutely staggering. Vivian had spent the last decade terrorizing this family, and everyone in her social circle using that mansion as her ultimate weapon. She hosted exclusive charity galas in the grand ballroom. She flaunted the manicured gardens and the imported marble columns as proof of her superior breeding and financial dominance. The entire illusion of her high society royalty was built on the foundation of that sprawling estate. And the entire time, it was an absolute lie. She was nothing more than a permanent houseguest living on borrowed time. I reached out and carefully took the key from Ruby. The metal was warm from being pressed against her skin. My forensic accounting brain immediately began running through the legal ramifications. If Vivian had forged financial documents while living in a house she did not own and used that house as collateral for any unauthorized loans, the level of fraud we were dealing with was catastrophic. "We cannot leave this key in the house," I said, my voice tight with urgency. "Megan is going to call Vivian the second she gets into her car. When Vivian realizes the movers failed to secure the dresser, she is going to panic. She knows exactly what is at stake. She will force Terrence onto the very next flight back from Cabo San Lucas to handle this himself. We need to secure the original documents before they try to lock us out of the safe deposit box. Ruby nodded, her expression hardening into pure determination. Then we go to the bank right now, she said. I spent the next 20 minutes helping Ruby out of her nightgown and into a warm pair of slacks and a thick wool coat. We moved quickly and quietly. I did not want to risk Megan circling back or sitting in her car down the street watching the house. I guided Ruby through the interior garage door and helped her into the passenger seat of my car. We drove out of the suburban neighborhood and headed straight for the downtown financial district. The First National Bank was an imposing stone building that catered to the old money elite of Atlanta. Because Ruby had not been seen in public for nearly a year, I walked her through the private rear entrance usually reserved for high-wealth clients. The vault manager recognized her immediately. He did not ask any questions about her supposed dementia. He simply checked her identification, verified her biometric fingerprint, and escorted us down into the silent, heavily guarded basement vault. We walked down the long rows of polished steel boxes until we reached her specific unit. I inserted the vintage brass key into the lock while the manager inserted his master key. The heavy metal door clicked open. Inside the long metallic drawer was a single thick manila envelope. I pulled the envelope out and opened the metal clasp. My hands were actually shaking as I slid the crisp, heavy parchment papers into the bright fluorescent light. It was the original master deed to the estate. I scanned the legal jargon, my eyes darting straight to the signatures and the ownership clauses. It was completely ironclad. The property belonged solely and entirely to Ruby. There were no joint tenancy clauses. There were no transfer agreements. Vivian had absolutely no legal claim to the property whatsoever. I carefully placed the deed into my leather work briefcase, right next to the encrypted hard drive containing all of Terrence's stolen server data. I felt like I was carrying a loaded weapon. We had the financial records proving their embezzlement. We had the undeniable proof that their primary asset was a total fabrication. We held every single card in the deck. We drove back to the house in a triumphant silence. The pieces of the trap were perfectly aligned. But I knew the hardest part was still coming. Terrence and Vivian were cornered animals, and cornered animals are incredibly dangerous. Megan had threatened to call Adult Protective Services on her way out, and I fully expected a knock on the door from a state social worker. But as the afternoon dragged into the early evening, the house remained completely quiet. I made Ruby a hot meal and set up a temporary workstation on the kitchen island, cross-referencing the downloaded bank ledgers with the property taxes on the mansion. The level of financial deception Terrence had engaged in was breathtaking. He had been bleeding his own grandmother dry to keep his fake tech company afloat while his mother lived like a queen in a stolen castle. The sun had completely set, casting long, dark shadows across the driveway. I was just about to pack up my documents for the night when the security alert on my phone suddenly chimed. I looked down at the screen. The exterior camera feed showed a black luxury town car pulling aggressively into the driveway. The doors flew open before the vehicle had even completely stopped. It was not the police. It was not a social worker from the state. It was Terrence and Vivian. They had abandoned their luxury vacation and rushed back to Atlanta the moment Megan delivered the bad news. Vivian was marching up the front walkway, her face twisted in absolute rage. Terrence was right behind her carrying a heavy leather briefcase. But they were not alone. Trailing closely behind them, carrying a black medical bag, was a tall man in a tailored suit. I recognized him instantly from Vivian's country club photos. It was Dr. Eris. He was the corrupt private physician Vivian kept on her payroll, the same man who had falsely diagnosed Ruby with severe dementia a year ago to help them seize control of her accounts. They were not here to argue. They were here to execute a hostile takeover. They had brought the doctor to officially declare me mentally unfit and forcibly remove Ruby from the house tonight. I calmly closed my laptop, slid the leather briefcase containing the deed behind the kitchen counter, and walked down the hallway to stand between them and the guest wing. The real war was about to begin. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the foyer like a gunshot. Vivian marched directly toward me down the hallway. She was still wearing her expensive resort wear, a flowing silk caftan that looked entirely out of place against the furious, ugly snarl twisting her features. Her perfect luxury vacation had been ruined, and she was out for blood. The smell of coconut sunscreen and overpriced airport perfume wafted off her a sickening reminder of where she had been while her mother-in-law was freezing in the dark. Terence was right on her heels. The sun-kissed tan on his face did nothing to hide the dark, panicked circles under his eyes. He dropped his leather travel bag onto the floor with a loud thud, his hands curling into tight fists. He looked like a man who knew his entire house of cards was swaying in the wind. "Get out of my way, Kendra," Vivian hissed. She did not bother with her usual passive-aggressive tone or her fake, polite smile. The mask was completely off. "You have absolutely lost your mind. Megan called me in tears this morning. She told me everything. You locked out the professional movers I hired you, started screaming about wild conspiracies, and now you are hoarding my mother-in-law like some deranged lunatic. You are having a psychological breakdown and I will not allow it in my house." Terence stepped forward, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of physical intimidation. "We are done playing nice, Kendra," he growled. "You are mentally unstable. You are endangering an 82-year-old woman because you want to play nurse to get back at me for freezing the credit cards. Move aside right now before I physically move you myself." I did not flinch. I kept my feet firmly planted in the center of the hallway, my shoulders squared. I looked my husband dead in the eye. "No one is going into that room. And if you lay a single hand on me, Terence, the police will be here in 3 minutes and they will not be leaving without you in handcuffs." Vivian let out a sharp, cruel laugh. It was a cold sound that grated against the walls. "Call the police," she mocked, waving her manicured hand. "Please do. Because I anticipated your hysterical behavior. That is exactly why I brought a medical professional to explain to the authorities exactly what is happening here." She stepped aside, gesturing to the tall man standing quietly behind them. Dr. Aris stepped forward into the harsh hallway lighting. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and a condescending smirk that perfectly matched Vivian's toxic energy. He looked less like a medical doctor and more like a high-priced fixer for the elite, which was exactly what he was. He was the man who traded his medical ethics for envelopes of cash from wealthy families who needed inconvenient relatives diagnosed and hidden away. "Mrs. Brooks," he said smoothly, addressing me with an air of clinical superiority, "your mother-in-law contacted me with grave concerns about your current mental state and Ruby's rapidly declining health. As Ruby's primary physician on record, I have a legal and moral obligation to intervene when a patient is being kept in an unsafe environment by an unstable, hostile caregiver." I stared at him, my disgust rising so fast it tasted bitter in the back of my throat. "Unsafe environment," I repeated, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. My husband intentionally turned off the heat in her room and left her to freeze to death while they drank margaritas in Mexico. "You call that safe?" Vivian rolled her eyes dramatically, looking at Dr. Aris with exaggerated pity. "Listen to her, Aris. She is hallucinating. The heat in this house is perfectly fine. You are hysterical, Kendra. You are completely unfit to make any rational decisions, and your erratic behavior is a massive liability to this family." Dr. Aris did not argue. He simply opened his black leather medical bag. He did not pull out a stethoscope to check on his supposed patient. He did not ask to see her vitals. He reached inside the velvet-lined compartment and pulled out a large pre-filled syringe. The amber liquid inside the plastic barrel looked thick and terrifying. "Ruby is clearly suffering from severe agitation caused by your disruptive behavior," Dr. Aris said casually, tapping the side of the syringe to clear a tiny air bubble. "I am going to administer a heavy sedative to stabilize her system. Once she is fully compliant, we have a private transport vehicle waiting outside in the driveway to transfer her immediately to a state-approved long-term care facility. It is a place equipped to handle patients whose families can no longer safely house them." My forensic mind raced, analyzing the horrific reality of their plan. I knew exactly what kind of state-approved facility Vivian had arranged. It would be a severely underfunded, overcrowded warehouse for the forgotten elderly. A place where Ruby would be strapped to a cheap mattress, heavily over-medicated by apathetic staff, and ignored until she quietly passed away. It was a literal death sentence. And by bringing Dr. Eris here tonight to drug her into absolute submission, Vivian was ensuring Ruby could not protest or demonstrate her actual mental clarity to the transport team or the intake nurses. They were going to chemically erase her. "You are not injecting her with anything," I said, my voice dropping an octave, radiating an absolute unyielding authority. "She is not agitated. She is resting peacefully, and she is not going to any facility tonight or any other night." Terrence took another aggressive step toward me, closing the distance until he was standing mere inches away. He pointed a finger right at my face. "You do not make the calls in this house anymore, Kendra. We have the legal medical power of attorney. We have her official doctor standing right here with a prescribed treatment plan. You have absolutely nothing. You are a glorified calculator who married into a world you do not understand and cannot control. Now step aside, or I swear to God I will have Eris sedate you too." He was trying to break me. He was relying entirely on the old dynamic of our marriage, the one where he barked vicious orders and I quietly folded to keep the peace. He expected me to burst into tears, doubt my own sanity, or shrink against the wall in defeat. But he had absolutely no idea what was sitting inside my leather briefcase in the kitchen. He had no idea that the woman lying in the bedroom behind me held the keys to his absolute destruction. I looked from Terrence's panicked, bloodshot eyes to Vivian's furious glare, and finally to the corrupt doctor holding the needle ready to poison an 82-year-old woman. They were desperate, they were dangerous, and they were completely out of time. Terrence lunged forward, his large hand clamped down hard on my shoulder, his fingers digging fiercely into my tailored blazer. "Give me the medical power of attorney documents right now," he shouted, his face inches from mine. "You are not going to ruin my life because you want to play a superhero. I am her grandson. My mother is her proxy. We are taking her out of this house tonight, and you are going to stand there and watch." I did not shrink away from his grip. I looked down at his hand and then back up to his eyes. "Remove your hand from my body, Terrence," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "If you leave a bruise on me, I will add domestic battery to the list of charges you are going to face tonight." He hesitated, the absolute certainty in my voice throwing him off balance. He slowly released my shoulder but remained blocking my path, trying to use his height to cast a shadow over me. Before he could issue another threat, a loud trembling wail echoed from the guest bedroom behind me. Ruby had heard the commotion and decided it was time to deliver her performance. She shuffled out of the bedroom doorway, clutching the doorframe for support. Her hair was perfectly disheveled, and her shoulders were slumped in an exaggerated posture of extreme frailty. She looked at Dr. Eris and the heavy syringe in his hand, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. "No, please, no," she cried out, her voice cracking with the perfect pitch of a confused, frightened dementia patient. "Do not let the bad man poke me. He hurts me. Please do not let him put me in the dark box again. Where is my husband? I want my husband." It was an absolute masterpiece of acting. Vivian rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her silk caftan. "Oh, stop the theatrics!" Ruby Vivian snapped, stepping forward. "Aris, just grab her arm and administer the sedative. We do not have time for this nonsense. The transport team is waiting in the driveway and the hourly meter is running." Dr. Aris took a confident step forward, raising the needle, entirely accustomed to forcing compliance on vulnerable patients whose families were quietly writing his paychecks. I stepped squarely between him and Ruby. I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer and pulled out a thick, folded legal document stamped with the official blue seal of the Fulton County Family Court. I held it up right in front of Dr. Eris's face, forcing him to stop strictly in his tracks. "I suggest you put that needle away right now, Dr. Aris," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings of the hallway. "Because as of 10 o'clock this morning, Vivian's medical power of attorney is completely null and void." Terrence let out a harsh bark of laughter. "You are lying. You cannot just cancel a legal proxy without a hearing." I ignored my husband entirely and kept my eyes locked firmly on the corrupt physician. "This is an emergency protective injunction signed by Judge Reynolds," I explained, unfolding the document so the official signatures were clearly visible under the hall lights. I spent the morning at the courthouse filing an emergency petition for temporary guardianship. I submitted date-stamped photographs of the freezing room you left her in. I submitted the yellow post-it note. Terrence wrote explicitly, instructing me to use my own money to keep her alive while he froze our joint accounts. I also submitted a sworn affidavit from a highly respected concierge physician who examined Ruby last night and documented severe dehydration, malnutrition, and intentional physical neglect. Vivian's face went completely pale. The arrogant smirk vanished from Dr. Eris's face instantly. He lowered the syringe, his eyes darting nervously to the legal seal on the paper. Based on the overwhelming evidence of elder abuse, the judge granted my petition immediately. I continued my words, striking them like a hammer. I am now Ruby's court-appointed sole legal guardian. Vivian has no legal authority over her medical care, her living arrangements, or her physical person. I took a step closer to Dr. Eris, lowering my voice into a lethal whisper meant only for him. If you push past me and plunge that needle into my ward's arm, it is no longer a medical procedure authorized by a family member. It is aggravated assault. It is forced chemical imprisonment. I will personally call the police and have you arrested before you reach your car. I will hand this injunction to the state medical board tomorrow morning, and I will make sure they strip your license by sunset. You will never practice medicine again, and you will spend the next 5 years in a federal prison. Dr. Aris was a greedy man, but he was not a martyr. He made his living in the shadows, feeding off the quiet corruption of the wealthy elite. He survived by avoiding the harsh light of the legal system at all costs. Facing a furious, highly competent forensic accountant armed with a judge's order was not in his job description. He looked at the blue seal on the injunction. Then he looked at Vivian, his expression hardening into pure self-preservation. I am sorry, Vivian, he said quickly, capping the heavy syringe and dropping it back into his black leather medical bag. This is a civil matter now. My presence here is entirely compromised. I cannot intervene against a court-ordered guardianship. Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her chest. Aris, you coward. I pay you an absolute fortune. You cannot just leave us here to deal with this lunatic. I am not risking my medical license for your messy family disputes. He shot back, his professional facade completely crumbling as he backed away toward the front door. You told me the proxy was secure. You lied to me. I am leaving. Do not contact my private office again. Dr. Eris turned on his heel, practically sprinting out the front door and disappearing into the night. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, leaving Terrence and Vivian standing alone in the hallway, entirely stripped of their hired muscle. Ruby continued to whimper softly behind me, playing her part to absolute perfection, but I could hear the faint, satisfied amusement in her breathing. I carefully folded the court document and slid it back into my pocket. I looked at my husband and my mother-in-law. Their grand plan to kidnap an old woman, chemically silence her, and hide their massive financial crimes had just disintegrated in front of their eyes. Vivian looked like she was about to have a genuine stroke. Her chest heaved and she leaned against the wall for support, completely unable to comprehend that she had been outplayed by the woman she considered the hired help. I expected Terrence to start screaming. I expected him to throw a tantrum, punch the wall, or threaten to call his expensive corporate lawyers. But he did none of those things. As the silence stretched through the hallway, the panic that had been radiating off him just moments ago slowly vanished. Terrence straightened his posture. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive linen resort shirt, and then slowly, a cold, arrogant smirk spread across his face. Vivian was hyperventilating, clutching the collar of her silk caftan as she watched her expensive doctor speed away down the driveway. She turned to Terrence, demanding he do something, demanding he call their corporate lawyers to fix this disaster immediately. But Terrence simply ignored her. He maintained that chilling, arrogant smirk. He walked past me, deliberately brushing his shoulder hard against mine, and headed straight into the custom-designed kitchen. He dropped his heavy leather briefcase onto the marble island, the exact spot where I had found his cruel yellow post-it note just 24 hours ago. You always think you are the smartest person in the room, Kendra, he said, unlatching the brass clasps of his briefcase. You think because you spend your days looking at spreadsheets and corporate tax returns that you hold some kind of intellectual high ground over this family. You thought filing a temporary guardianship injunction behind my back was a brilliant checkmate. But you forget exactly who you are dealing with. I built a tech company from the ground up. I know how to aggressively restructure assets when an investment goes bad. And my investment in our marriage went bad a very long time ago. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a crisp manila folder. He tossed it across the marble island. It slid perfectly to a stop right in front of me. I looked down at the label, my professional instincts immediately recognizing the distinct formatting of a county property filing. I opened the folder. Inside was a quitclaim deed to our sprawling suburban home, fully executed and officially stamped by the Fulton County Clerk. I scanned the dense legal jargon, my eyes darting straight to the ownership clauses. According to this document, I had voluntarily surrendered all of my equity and ownership rights to the property. The paperwork legally transferred the house entirely into a private limited liability company controlled solely by Terrence. At the bottom of the last page was my signature. It was an incredibly convincing forgery. It matched the exact slant and pressure of my handwriting right down to the specific way I looped my vowels. Right next to it was the bright red official stamp of a notary public. "I did not sign this," I said, my voice intentionally flat, masking the massive surge of adrenaline rushing through my veins. "You forged my signature, and you bribed a notary to validate it. This is not just a dirty divorce tactic, Terrence. This is a massive federal crime. You just handed me written proof of real estate fraud." Terrence laughed out loud, a harsh, echoing sound that filled the kitchen. "Prove it," he challenged, leaning his hands against the marble counter and staring at me with absolute contempt. "My notary is a fraternity brother who owes me a massive favor. He will swear under oath in any courtroom that you sat right across from him and signed that paper willingly. By the time you hire a forensic handwriting expert and drag this through years of civil litigation, my company will have gone public. I will drown you in legal fees until you are entirely bankrupt and begging for a settlement. You are completely out, Kendra. You have absolutely zero legal right to stand in this house." He reached back into his briefcase and pulled out one final piece of paper. He walked around the kitchen island and shoved the document directly against my chest. I took it from him, looking down at the bold black letters printed at the top of the page. It was a formal, legally binding 48-hour eviction notice. "You wanted to be a hero," Terrence sneered, stepping so close I could smell the stale airplane liquor on his breath. "You wanted the legal responsibility of playing nursemaid to a senile old woman. Well, congratulations, Kendra. You won the grand prize. You are officially her court-appointed guardian, which means she is entirely your problem now. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your cheap work suits, take the old bat with you, and get off my property forever." Vivian, who had finally stopped hyperventilating in the hallway, walked confidently into the kitchen. The color had returned to her face and her signature arrogance was fully restored. She looked at the eviction notice in my hand and let out a vicious, triumphant sigh. "I told you Terrence was always 10 steps ahead of you," Vivian said, walking over to the refrigerator to pour herself a glass of filtered water. "You really thought you could outsmart this family with a cheap piece of courthouse paper? Now you are going to end up exactly where you belong, living in some miserable, cramped apartment on the wrong side of town, changing adult diapers while my son moves on to someone who actually understands our lifestyle. I suggest you start packing your bags right now. The clock is officially ticking." I looked down at the eviction notice, forcing my shoulders to slump. I let my eyes widen slightly, projecting the exact image of a defeated, broken woman they so desperately wanted to see. I needed them to believe they had completely destroyed me. I needed them to feel entirely invincible, because invincibility breeds the kind of reckless arrogance that leads directly to a federal prison sentence. They thought they were throwing me out into the cold to suffer. They had absolutely no idea that Grandma Ruby and I had already secured a $15,000 a month luxury penthouse suite using her secret trust fund. They had no idea that my leatherwork briefcase, currently sitting just 3 feet away, hidden behind the kitchen counter, contained the downloaded server files proving Terrence's massive corporate embezzlement. And most importantly, Vivian had no idea that sitting right next to those files was the original master deed proving she did not even own her own mansion. I slowly folded the eviction notice and put it in my jacket pocket. "You win, Terrence," I whispered, making my voice tremble just enough to sell the performance of a shattered wife. "I will pack my things. We will be gone by tomorrow morning." Terrence smirked, turning his back on me to pour himself a celebratory drink from the liquor cabinet. Vivian smiled, raising her glass of water in a mocking toast. I turned around and walked back down the hallway to the guest room, shutting the heavy wooden door securely behind me. Ruby was sitting on the edge of the bare mattress, her eyes sharp, clear, and waiting. She raised a questioning eyebrow as I walked toward her. I smiled, the fake defeat instantly vanishing from my face, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. "Pack your bags, Grandma," I said quietly. "They just handed us the match to burn their entire empire to the ground." Terrence and Vivian stood in the grand hallway, sipping celebratory drinks from crystal glasses, watching me wheel 2 large suitcases toward the front door. They actually clapped when I guided Grandma Ruby out of the freezing guest wing and into the foyer. Terrence leaned against the doorway, a smug grin plastered across his face, and shouted a final insult as we stepped out into the cool night air. He told me to enjoy the local homeless shelter and reminded me that my frozen credit cards would not even cover a cheap motel room. I did not look back. I did not offer a single word of rebuttal. I simply helped Ruby into the passenger seat of my car, loaded our bags into the trunk, and drove away from the sprawling suburban prison I had called home for the last 5 years. We did not go to a shelter. We did not go to a budget motel. We drove straight to the most exclusive high-rise residential tower in the downtown Atlanta financial district. Earlier that afternoon, while Terrence and Vivian were frantically flying back from Cabo San Lucas, I had made a single phone call to the wealth management firm handling Ruby's $45 million blind trust. Within an hour, they had secured a year-long lease on a $15,000 a month penthouse suite. We walked out of the private elevator and into the massive apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, glittering view of the city skyline. The floors were imported marble, the kitchen was designed for a private chef, and the climate control was absolutely perfect. I had already arranged for a highly paid, discreet private caregiver to meet us there. She immediately took charge of Ruby's comfort, settling her into a luxurious master suite that was a stark, poetic contrast to the dark, freezing room Terrence had locked her in. By the next morning, I had completely transformed the enormous glass dining table into a forensic accounting war room. I set up my laptop, 2 high-resolution external monitors, and a portable laser printer I had purchased on the way to the penthouse. I plugged in the encrypted hard drive containing all the data I had scraped from Terrence's home server. Ruby sat in a plush armchair near the window, sipping hot herbal tea and watching me work with a look of fierce, unyielding pride. I opened the first ledger. It was time to follow the money. Terrence was incredibly arrogant, but as I quickly discovered, he was a remarkably sloppy criminal. He had used a series of limited liability companies registered in Delaware to wash the $2.5 million he had siphoned from Ruby's local decoy accounts. He thought that layering the wire transfers through different regional banks would make the money untraceable. He assumed his generic tech jargon and fake invoice numbers would be enough to fool a standard tax audit. But to a certified forensic accountant who spent her entire career unwinding complex corporate embezzlement, his digital trail looked like a brightly lit runway. I tracked every single penny. I matched the forged wire transfers directly to deposits made into his tech startup's primary operating account. But as I dug deeper into his corporate books, the scope of the fraud suddenly expanded exponentially. Terrence was not just stealing from his grandmother to keep his business afloat. He was actively and aggressively defrauding his own corporate investors. His tech startup, which he constantly bragged was revolutionizing cloud storage security, was nothing but a hollow shell. I pulled the payroll records and the vendor contracts. They had zero actual software development happening. They had no real engineering team, no patents, and absolutely no functional product. Terrence had been soliciting tens of millions of dollars from high-net-worth angel investors, promising them massive quarterly returns based on fabricated growth projections. Instead of using that capital to build a legitimate business, he was using it to fund his lavish lifestyle and prop up Vivian's fake high society image. I pulled up the investor prospectuses and cross-referenced them with his personal bank statements. The mechanics of his operation were sickeningly clear. It was a classic textbook Ponzi scheme. He was using the $2.5 million he stole from Ruby to pay fake dividends to his early corporate investors, keeping them quiet and happy, while he aggressively courted new funding. He was falsifying quarterly earnings reports, forging the signatures of fake board members, and blatantly committing wire fraud across state lines. He had purchased luxury cars, chartered private jets for Vivian's vacations, and bought expensive jewelry for his brother's wife Megan, all using stolen investor capital disguised as corporate marketing expenses. If the Securities and Exchange Commission caught even a glimpse of these ledgers, Terrence would not just face a civil lawsuit for elder abuse. He would be indicted on dozens of federal felony charges, the kind of charges that carry mandatory minimum prison sentences. I printed out the most damning ledgers highlighting the forged signatures and the illegal offshore transfers in bright yellow ink. I pinned them to a large corkboard I had set up against the wall, drawing thick red lines connecting Terrence's fake tech company directly to Vivian's personal bank accounts. They were entirely codependent. Vivian used Terrence's fake corporate success to attract wealthy, gullible donors to her charity galas, and Terrence used Vivian's high society charity connections to find his next wealthy investment victims. They had built their entire untouchable empire on a foundation of absolute criminal lies. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the web of undeniable felony fraud spread across my monitors. I felt a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. Terrence had handed me an eviction notice because he thought stripping me of my marital home would leave me completely powerless and consumed by panic. He thought he was throwing me out into the street. He had absolutely no idea he had just given me the uninterrupted time, the unlimited resources, and the perfect quiet space I needed to draft his federal indictment. I was still staring at the web of undeniable felony fraud spread across my monitors when the sharp vibration of my cell phone broke the absolute silence of the penthouse. The screen illuminated on the glass dining table, casting a harsh white glow over the printed ledgers. I picked up the device and looked at the caller identification. It was a text message from Megan. Under normal circumstances, I would have blocked her number the second I drove away from Terrence's house. But in a high-stakes financial investigation, every point of contact is a potential vulnerability you can exploit. I opened the message. "Are you somewhere secure?" she wrote. "Do not tell Terrence or Vivian that I am contacting you." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. Megan was a parasite, and parasites possess an incredible survival instinct. They always know exactly when the host is about to die. She must have returned to the mansion after her failed attempt to steal the antique dresser, only to walk into the absolute chaos of Terrence and Vivian frantically trying to cover their tracks. Megan was arrogant, but she was not completely stupid. She could smell the blood in the water. She realized that Terrence and Vivian were circling the wagons to protect themselves, and they were fully prepared to cut her and her husband entirely out of the family wealth to survive. I typed my response slowly, ensuring my tone was completely devoid of emotion. "I am busy, Megan. State your business or I am blocking this number." The three gray typing dots appeared on the screen almost instantly. She was panicking. She was likely hiding in one of the mansion's massive guest bathrooms, frantically trying to secure her own golden parachute before the entire estate collapsed. "I know what you are doing," she replied a minute later. "I overheard Terrence screaming at Vivian in the study. He said you have a court order for Ruby, and that you took his corporate hard drive. They are panicking, Kendra. They are liquidating assets tonight. They are trying to move everything into Vivian's offshore accounts before you can freeze them. They are cutting my husband out of the trust completely. I am not going down with them." I read the text twice. Megan did not care about justice. She did not care that her husband's family had tortured an 82-year-old woman, and she certainly did not care about the federal wire fraud Terrence was committing. She only cared about maintaining her country club membership and her luxury lease on her imported SUV. The moment she realized the money was drying up, her loyalty to Vivian evaporated entirely. "What do you want, Megan?" I texted back. I kept my sentences short, forcing her to show her entire hand. "I have the keys to the kingdom," she wrote. "Vivian is careless. She leaves her personal laptop unlocked all the time. I know you are trying to build a financial case against them, but you will never be able to touch the money in the Caymans without the primary account numbers and the biometric security tokens. I have them. I downloaded her entire password vault onto a flash drive. I will give you everything you need to completely destroy her, but it is going to cost you." The sheer audacity of the woman was breathtaking. She was actively participating in a criminal conspiracy, and now she was trying to extort the person holding the federal hammer. "How much?" I asked. $100,000, Megan demanded, in untraceable cryptocurrency, transferred to my digital wallet by midnight. "Once the transfer clears, I will send you the decryption key for the flash drive, and you can drain Vivian's offshore accounts dry." I let out a cold, sharp laugh that echoed through the penthouse. Megan was trying to play a high-level extortion game with a certified forensic accountant. She was stepping into an arena where she was entirely outmatched. I needed that offshore banking data to definitively link Vivian to the stolen funds Terrence was funneling out of the country. But I was absolutely not going to pay a dime for it. I needed to bait her into handing over the evidence for free. I needed to attack the one thing she could never protect: her massive, fragile ego. "You are bluffing, Megan," I typed, deliberately provoking her. "Vivian is a paranoid woman. She would never leave something that sensitive accessible to you. She treats you like the hired help. You do not have access to any offshore accounts. Stop wasting my time." I set the phone down and watched the screen. I knew exactly how she would react. Megan spent her entire life desperately trying to prove she belonged in the inner circle of that affluent family. Being told she was just a clueless outsider mimicking her mother-in-law was the ultimate insult. The typing indicator flared wildly. She was furious. She was typing so fast I could practically hear her manicured nails hammering against her phone screen. "I am not an idiot, Kendra," she shot back. "I am 10 times smarter than Vivian. I installed a digital keylogger on her personal laptop 3 months ago. I see every single keystroke she makes. I am looking right at the Cayman Islands dashboard right now." I felt a rush of absolute victory. She had just confessed in writing to illegal wiretapping, unauthorized access to a secure financial network, and felony extortion. I had her perfectly boxed in. But I needed the final piece of the puzzle. I needed the routing numbers. "Words are cheap, Megan," I replied. "I am not wiring 6 figures based on a story about a keylogger. I need proof of life. Prove you actually have access to the dashboard. Send me a screenshot of the main holding account showing Vivian's name and today's date. If the money is real, I will initiate the crypto transfer immediately." There was a long pause. For a moment, I wondered if her greed would finally be overridden by basic common sense. But Megan had never possessed common sense. 2 minutes later, my phone chimed with 3 incoming image files. I opened the high-resolution images and immediately transferred them to my secure laptop screen. They were absolutely flawless. Megan had taken photos of Vivian's laptop screen using her phone. The images clearly displayed the secure portal for an elite offshore bank based in the Cayman Islands. The primary account holder was listed as Vivian Brooks. The routing numbers were completely visible, and sitting directly in the available balance column was an astounding $8.5 million. It was the exact sum Terrence had stolen from his corporate investors, washed through his fake tech startup, and hidden away under his mother's name to avoid IRS detection. Megan had just handed me the smoking gun. "Are you ready to transfer the money?" She texted, her tone radiating smug satisfaction. I did not reply to her immediately. Instead, I carefully backed up the 3 screenshots to my encrypted cloud server. I ran an extraction protocol on the image files, pulling the hidden metadata. The digital footprint embedded in the photos confirmed they were taken exactly 4 minutes ago, geolocated precisely to the master suite of Vivian's suburban mansion. Then I took full screenshots of our entire text message conversation, capturing every single one of her extortion demands, her confession to installing the keylogger, and her attempt to sell stolen financial data. I organized the files into a new digital folder on my desktop and labeled it Exhibit C. I picked up my phone one last time. Let me verify these routing numbers against the domestic ledgers I have. I texted her. Give me 24 hours to secure the cryptocurrency exchange. Do not contact me again until I reach out to you. Okay, she replied instantly. But if you try to screw me, Kendra, I will wipe the flash drive and you will never find the money. I locked my phone screen and tossed it back onto the glass table. Megan thought she had just outsmarted everyone and secured her financial independence. She thought she was a criminal mastermind walking away with a fortune. She had absolutely no idea that I had just weaponized her own greed to build a bulletproof federal conspiracy case against her. I turned back to my monitors, adding Megan's name to the top of the corkboard right next to Terrence and Vivian. The trap was fully set. Now I just needed to invite them all to the execution. I turned my attention back to the massive corkboard leaning against the penthouse wall. Megan had handed me the offshore destination of the stolen funds. But my forensic instincts told me there was still one massive piece missing from the origin of the money. The $8.5 million sitting in the Cayman Islands was a combination of stolen investor capital and the money Terrence had drained from Grandma Ruby's local checking accounts. But as I ran the final calculations on my laptop, the math still did not perfectly align. Terrence's tech startup had been bleeding cash for 2 solid years. He had rented expensive downtown office space, hired a massive marketing team to build his fake public image, and bought luxury company cars. He needed a massive sudden influx of capital just to keep the lights on long enough to start soliciting those high net worth angel investors. The $2.5 million he stole from Ruby would not have been enough to cover his enormous operating deficit. Where did that initial massive burst of funding come from? I reached into my leather work briefcase and pulled out the original master deed to the mansion. The heavy parchment paper that Ruby and I had retrieved from the downtown bank vault felt heavy in my hands. I set it down on the glass dining table and looked at the property identification number printed at the top of the page. I opened a secure portal to the state real estate registry, bypassed the public viewing restrictions using my corporate auditor credentials, and ran a deep background search on the property title. The search results populated on my high-resolution monitor, and the air completely left my lungs. There, listed under the active encumbrances section of the state registry, was a massive commercial lien. Exactly 6 months ago, a federally insured national bank had issued a $5 million equity loan against the sprawling suburban estate. I hacked deeper into the digital loan documents Terrence had buried in his encrypted home server files. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I pulled up the original loan application. Terrence had used the mansion as collateral to secure an emergency commercial loan to float his failing tech company. But because Vivian did not actually own the house, she could not legally authorize the lien on her own. The bank required the signature of the primary deed holder. So Terrence did what he always did when the rules did not apply to his absolute entitlement. He committed a breathtaking, incredibly stupid act of criminal fraud. I opened the signature page of the loan agreement on my screen. Right there on the bottom line was Grandma Ruby's name. It was forged with the exact same sickening precision Terrence had used on my fake eviction notice. Right next to her forged signature was Vivian's signature acting as the corporate guarantor, and the bright red stamp of the exact same corrupt notary public who had helped Terrence steal my marital home. They had stolen Ruby's identity, falsified her legal consent, and pledged her only unencumbered asset to a major financial institution. They took the $5 million from the bank, pumped it into the tech startup to make the company look profitable, used that fake profitability to steal millions more from private investors, and then funneled the excess cash straight into Vivian's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. This was the kill shot. Taking money from a grandmother's personal checking account was state-level elder abuse. Defrauding private tech investors was corporate malfeasance. But defrauding a federally insured national bank for $5 million using a forged signature and a stolen property deed was a completely different beast entirely. It was federal bank fraud, It was aggravated identity theft. It was felony wire fraud. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not offer quiet plea deals or slap a fine on these types of crimes. When you defraud a federal bank for millions of dollars, they kick down the heavy oak doors of your mansion and drag you out in handcuffs. Terrence and Vivian were no longer just facing a messy civil lawsuit or social embarrassment. They were facing mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary. They were facing hard prison time. I called Ruby over to the table. She walked across the marble floor, her posture straight and her eyes sharp. She stood behind my chair, her hands resting gently on my shoulders as I pointed to the forged loan documents glowing on the monitor. I explained the exact mechanics of what her grandson had done. I explained the federal loan, the forged signature, and the offshore accounts. I watched her jaw clench. Her eyes narrowed into dark, furious slits as she absorbed the absolute depth of his betrayal. Terrence did not just lock her in a freezing room to die. He had actively tried to steal the very roof over her head, pledging her legacy to a bank just to feed his own narcissistic ego. "We have everything we need," I told her softly, looking up at her reflection in the dark window glass. "We have every forged signature, every hidden bank ledger, the extortion texts from Megan, and the exact routing numbers for their stolen wealth. The trap is completely bulletproof. Now we just need the perfect audience." Ruby looked down at the documents, a slow, incredibly dangerous smile spreading across her face. "Tomorrow night is Vivian's annual foundation gala," she said, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "It is the biggest social event of the year. Every wealthy donor, every tech investor, and every high society snob in Atlanta will be sitting in that ballroom. Terrence is scheduled to give the keynote address to secure his next round of funding." It was the absolute perfect venue. Terrence and Vivian had spent their entire lives treating people like garbage, hiding their cruelty behind the glittering facade of their wealth and social standing. They worshipped their public image above all else. Destroying them in a quiet courtroom would never be enough. They needed to be eradicated in front of the exact people they spent their lives trying to impress. I spent the rest of the night compiling the evidence. I organized the bank records, the forged deeds, and Megan's extortion screenshots into high-gloss presentation binders. I printed a dozen perfectly collated copies. One for the federal authorities, one for the Securities and Exchange Commission, and plenty of copies for the wealthy angel investors Terrence had so arrogantly conned. I closed the final binder and placed it neatly into my leather briefcase. Terrence and Vivian thought they had discarded a senile old woman and a helpless wife. They were about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate the women who know how to count the receipts. I sat at the glass dining table as the morning sun flooded the penthouse. The federal evidence was securely packed in my briefcase, but all the evidence in the world meant nothing if I could not get Terrence and Vivian into a corner. They could not escape. I needed them all in one room, completely surrounded by the people they lied to at the absolute height of their arrogance. I opened my email client on my laptop. It was time to feed the beast. I spent the next 20 minutes crafting the most pathetic, desperate email of my entire life. I had to swallow every ounce of my pride to write the words, but I knew exactly what Terrence needed to hear. I needed him to believe that his cruel tactics had completely broken me. I typed out a fabricated story about how my frozen credit cards had left me completely destitute. I lied and said the cheap motel I had dragged us to was threatening to kick us out by noon because I could not afford the daily rate. I made sure to emphasize how terrified I was. Then I brought up Ruby. I told him her health had taken a drastic turn for the worse during the freezing night. I wrote that she was barely responsive and that the reality of being her sole court-appointed medical guardian was entirely overwhelming me. I played the role of the hysterical, incompetent woman who had bitten off far more than she could chew. I begged him for a truce. I knew Vivian was hosting her annual foundation gala that very evening at the grand ballroom of the Magnolia Hotel downtown. It was the absolute pinnacle of their social calendar. I asked Terrence to let me bring Ruby to the venue before the dinner service began. I offered to formally sign over the guardianship injunction back to Vivian right there in the lobby. I framed it as an act of absolute surrender, pleading with him to take the burden of his grandmother off my hands so I would not be held legally responsible if she passed away. I hit send and watched the email disappear from my outbox. Ruby was sitting across the table enjoying a plate of fresh fruit our private caregiver had prepared. She took a sip of her orange juice and raised an eyebrow at me. "He is going to take the bait," Ruby said, her voice rich with amusement. "Men like my grandson cannot resist the opportunity to watch a strong woman beg. He will want to see you on your knees." I did not have to wait long. Less than 45 minutes later, the notification chime echoed through the quiet penthouse. Terrence had replied. I opened the message and read his words. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic cruelty. He did not ask a single question about his grandmother's failing health. He did not express 1 ounce of concern or basic human decency. He skipped straight over the life and death reality I had fabricated and went directly to the terms of my surrender. He wrote that Vivian was entirely disgusted by my erratic behavior, but was willing to take the burden of the old bat back under her control solely to save the family from any further public embarrassment. However, he made it explicitly clear that my attendance at the gala came with strict, non-negotiable conditions. Terrence was not going to let me just hand over a piece of paper and walk away. He wanted to parade my broken spirit in front of his wealthy investors. Condition number 1 was financial. Terrence attached a PDF file to the email. It was a heavily one-sided post-nuptial agreement drafted by his corporate lawyers. He demanded that I print it, sign it, and bring it with me to the gala. The document explicitly stated that I was walking away from our 5-year marriage with 0 alimony, 0 claim to his tech company, and absolutely no rights to any marital assets. He wanted me to legally guarantee my own poverty. Condition number 2 was social. He demanded that I walk up to the main podium in the grand ballroom right before his keynote speech. He wanted me to take the microphone and issue a formal public apology to both Vivian and Megan in front of the entire elite social circle of Atlanta. I had to explicitly state that I was mentally unstable, that I had acted out of extreme jealousy, and that I deeply regretted my actions over the past 48 hours. He wanted me to kiss the ring in front of hundreds of people. I stared at the glowing screen. Terrence thought he was locking me into a cage of absolute humiliation. He thought the post-nuptial agreement would protect his stolen wealth from our impending divorce. But a post-nuptial agreement means absolutely nothing when the assets it protects are entirely fraudulent and about to be seized by the federal government. I downloaded the legal document and sent it to my portable laser printer. The machine whirred to life, spitting out the crisp pages. I grabbed a black ink pen and signed my name on the bottom line of every single page with a smooth, steady hand. I did not feel an ounce of hesitation. I scanned the signed document back into my laptop and attached it to a new email. I kept my reply incredibly brief, maintaining the facade of a completely defeated woman who had no fight left in her. I signed the papers, Terrence, I typed. I agree to all your terms. I will make the public apology to your mother and Megan. Please just let us come inside tonight. I have nowhere else to go. I sent the reply and leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest. The waiting game resumed, but this time the tension was entirely gone. I had given him exactly what he wanted. I had stroked his massive ego and validated his cruel worldview. 10 minutes later, the final confirmation arrived. Terrence sent a short, incredibly smug response. See you at 8 o'clock, Kendra. Bring the signed papers and use the service elevator. My investors do not need to see you dragging that woman through the main lobby. I closed my laptop with a sharp, satisfying snap. The trap was completely set. The doors to the grand ballroom were officially open to us, and Terrence had practically rolled out the red carpet for his own destruction. I looked over at Grandma Ruby. She had finished her breakfast and was staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. We are in, I told her, a cold smile touching my lips. He wants a public apology on the main stage. Ruby turned away from the window, her eyes flashing with a fierce, brilliant light. Good, she said firmly. Then we need to make sure we are dressed appropriately for a public execution. No more soiled nightgowns and cheap hospital blankets. If Vivian wants to host a high society gala, we are going to show her exactly what true royalty looks like. I nodded, picking up my phone to call the private styling team I had booked earlier that morning. We had a lot of work to do before 8 o'clock. We were not going to sneak in through any service elevator. We were going to walk right through the front doors, and we were going to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. The private styling team arrived at the penthouse exactly at noon. I had spared absolutely no expense hiring the most exclusive boutique agency in the city, the kind of professionals who usually prepared elite celebrities for red carpet premieres. They wheeled in racks of designer garments, cases of high-end cosmetics, and a portable salon setup. When they saw Grandma Ruby sitting in the armchair, they did not see a frail dementia patient. They saw a canvas of pure, unadulterated royalty waiting to be uncovered. For the past year, Terrence and Vivian had forced Ruby to wear faded, oversized, soiled cotton nightgowns. They wanted her to look pathetic because it made it easier for them to strip her of her humanity. But those days were officially over. I watched as the stylists worked their magic. They washed and set her hair, styling her striking silver strands into an elegant sweeping updo that showcased her high cheekbones and sharp jawline. The pale, ashy complexion that came from a year of forced isolation and malnutrition was completely erased, replaced by a radiant, warm glow. Then came the dress. I had given the stylist explicit instructions regarding the color and the fabric. They brought out a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown. The rich jewel tone contrasted beautifully against her deep brown skin. The fabric flowed with a heavy, expensive grace, featuring a high-structured collar that demanded absolute respect. When they carefully helped her step into the gown and zipped up the back, the transformation was breathtaking. She did not look like an 82-year-old woman who needed to be locked in a freezing guest room. She looked like the undeniable matriarch of a dynasty. To complete the look, I opened the small velvet box I had retrieved from her downtown safety deposit box the day before. Inside was a vintage multi-carat diamond necklace and a matching set of drop earrings that her late husband had bought for her in Paris 40 years ago. Vivian had torn the house apart, looking for these specific jewels, assuming Ruby had lost them in her cognitive decline. I fastened the heavy diamond collar around her neck. The gems caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows, throwing fractured rainbows across the marble floor. Ruby looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror. Her spine was completely straight. Her eyes were sharp and fearless. She was a queen ready to reclaim her stolen kingdom. My own attire was significantly different, but no less intentional. I was not there to look like a socialite. I was there to perform a professional execution. I chose a sharply tailored midnight black power suit from my own closet. The cut was aggressive and flawless, featuring a structured blazer and wide-leg trousers that hid the pair of black stiletto heels I wore. I tied my hair back into a sleek, severe style. I wanted Terrence and Vivian to look at me and realize instantly that I was not the broken, hysterical wife who had begged them for mercy in an email that morning. I was the forensic accountant who had just dismantled their entire lives. Once the styling team packed up their equipment and left the penthouse, I turned my attention back to the massive glass dining table. It was time to assemble the arsenal. I had ordered 24 high-gloss, heavy-stock presentation folders. They were pitch black with a sleek, minimalist design. I wanted them to look like official corporate board materials, the exact kind of documents Terrence was used to handing out to his wealthy investors to secure his funding. But the contents of these folders were pure poison. I worked methodically, creating an assembly line across the long table. In the first section of every folder, I placed the federal bank loan documents. I used a bright red marker to circle Terrence's forged signature and the corrupt notary stamp. Right next to it, I placed a certified copy of the true unencumbered property deed, proving that Vivian did not own the mansion they had illegally used as collateral. In the second section, I placed the financial ledgers. I included the wire transfer receipts, proving Terrence had stolen $2.5 million from his grandmother's decoy accounts. I attached the flowcharts I had meticulously designed, showing exactly how he washed that stolen money through his fake tech startup to pay off his early angel investors in a textbook Ponzi scheme. The final section of the folder was dedicated entirely to his brother's wife. I printed the high-resolution screenshots of Vivian's Cayman Islands offshore bank accounts, clearly displaying the $8.5 million balance. And directly beneath those routing numbers, I placed the complete, unedited text message thread from Megan. Every single word of her extortion attempt was there in crisp black and white. Her demand for $100,000, her confession to installing a digital keylogger on Vivian's personal laptop, and her desperate attempt to sell out the family to save herself. I closed the final folder, running my hand over the smooth, glossy cover. The sheer weight of the evidence was staggering. If I handed these binders to a federal prosecutor right now, Terrence and Vivian would be indicted before the weekend was over. But handing them to the authorities in private was too clean. It was too easy. They had built their entire existence on the perception of their wealth and their elite social standing. Taking away their money would hurt them, but taking away their dignity in front of their peers would absolutely destroy them. I neatly stacked the glossy black binders and placed them into a heavy reinforced leather tote bag. I checked my gold wristwatch. It was 7:15 in the evening. The annual foundation gala started at 8 o'clock, which meant the cocktail hour was already winding down, and the wealthy guests would be taking their seats in the grand ballroom. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows where Ruby was standing. The sun had completely set, and the city lights of Atlanta were glowing brilliantly against the dark sky. Our private transport, an extended black luxury town car, was waiting idling at the curb directly below the high-rise. "Are you ready for this?" I asked, picking up the heavy leather tote bag and slinging it over my shoulder. Ruby turned away from the window, the diamonds at her neck glittering fiercely in the ambient light of the penthouse. She reached out and grasped the handle of her sleek, customized ebony walking cane. She did not actually need the cane to walk, but she carried it as an accessory, a physical reminder of the authority she possessed. "I have been ready for a year, Kendra," she said, her voice steady and echoing with anticipation. "Let us go crash a party." We took the private elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the cool evening air. The driver opened the rear door of the town car, and I carefully helped Ruby inside before sliding into the leather seat next to her. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing us in the quiet interior. As the car pulled away from the curb and merged into the downtown traffic, my pulse finally began to accelerate. Not out of fear, but out of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. We were heading straight for the Magnolia Hotel. In less than 45 minutes, Terrence would step up to a podium to tell a room full of millionaires how brilliant and successful he was. He expected me to walk out onto that stage, look at his mother, and publicly beg for their forgiveness. He expected a total surrender. He had absolutely no idea he was about to face a firing squad. The black luxury town car glided to a smooth halt in front of the Magnolia Hotel. The building was an architectural masterpiece of the Atlanta financial district, a towering structure of glass steel and old-world opulence. The valet attendants rushed forward to open our doors, their eyes widening slightly, as they took in the sheer elegance of our arrival. I stepped out first, adjusting the cuffs of my midnight black power suit. The night air was crisp, and a line of luxury vehicles stretched down the block, discharging the wealthiest and most influential members of the city elite. I walked to the trunk and retrieved a sleek, high-gloss transport wheelchair I had specifically ordered for this exact moment. It was a calculated theatrical choice. Terrence expected me to drag in a broken, dying woman. He expected a pathetic display. I wanted to give him the visual of a wheelchair to lull him into a split second of false security right before we completely dismantled his reality. I helped Grandma Ruby into the chair. She smoothed the skirt of her custom emerald green silk gown and rested both hands on the handle of her polished ebony walking cane. The multi-carat vintage diamonds around her neck caught the bright lights of the hotel marquee, broadcasting an undeniable aura of massive, untouchable wealth. She looked absolutely spectacular. We bypassed the side entrances and the service elevators Terrence had specifically ordered us to use. Instead, I pushed Ruby's chair directly up the center of the crimson carpet leading to the grand lobby. We moved past the massive floral arrangements and the crystal chandeliers drawing stares from late-arriving guests who recognized the sheer quality of Ruby's vintage diamonds. When we reached the second-floor mezzanine, the heavy mahogany double doors of the grand ballroom loomed ahead of us. Standing outside the doors were two event coordinators holding digital guest lists. They stepped forward to intercept us, their customer service smiles firmly in place. Before they could ask for our invitations, I looked them dead in the eye with an expression of absolute terrifying authority. I did not break my stride. I told them to step aside immediately. My tone left absolutely no room for debate. They took one look at Ruby's icy glare and instantly parted, pressing themselves flat against the flocked wallpaper. Through the thick wood of the double doors, I could hear Terrence's voice amplified by the massive sound system. He was right in the middle of his keynote address. I paused for just a moment, keeping my hands resting lightly on the grips of Ruby's chair, listening to the sickening lies echoing from the ballroom. Terrence was talking about family values. He was feeding a room full of potential angel investors, a fabricated story about how his grandfather's legacy had inspired his tech startup. He spoke with a smooth, practiced charisma, painting himself as a devoted grandson who was working tirelessly to build a company that honored his family name. He even threw in a fake, emotional pause, lowering his voice to express how deeply he cherished the unwavering support of his mother and his beloved wife. It was a masterful, sociopathic performance designed to separate rich men from their capital. I looked down at Ruby. She gave me a single sharp nod. I placed my hands flat against the brass push plates of the heavy mahogany doors and shoved them open with every ounce of strength I had. The heavy doors swung outward on their massive hinges, slamming against the interior walls with a deafening boom that echoed across the cavernous ballroom. The sudden violent noise instantly shattered the polished atmosphere of the gala. The live jazz band playing softly in the corner of the room faltered. The saxophone player squeaked a high, discordant note before the entire ensemble fell completely silent. Hundreds of heads snapped toward the entrance. The wealthy donors, the tech investors, and the high society elite all froze in their seats, their crystal wine glasses hovering halfway to their mouths. I pushed Ruby over the threshold and into the bright cascading light of the ballroom chandeliers. The visual impact was immediate and devastating. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide, clear path down the center aisle leading straight to the main stage. I walked with slow, deliberate precision. The wheels of Ruby's chair glided silently over the plush carpet, but the sharp, rhythmic click of my black stiletto heels echoed through the dead silence of the room. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead. Terrence was standing directly behind the clear acrylic podium on the main stage. His charismatic smile vanished instantly, wiped away by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His hands gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. Sitting at the main VIP table directly below the stage was Vivian. She was wearing a silver sequin designer gown, surrounded by the most powerful women in Atlanta society. When she turned her head and saw us coming down the aisle, her jaw literally dropped. She did not see a hysterical daughter-in-law dragging a frail dementia patient. She saw her absolute worst nightmare dressed in custom silk and diamonds. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Vivian's manicured fingers. It hit the marble base of her table and shattered into a dozen pieces, the sharp sound ringing out like a fire alarm in the silent ballroom. Terrence recovered from his initial shock, his panic rapidly morphing into an explosive, ugly rage. He abandoned his carefully crafted public persona entirely. He leaned away from the microphone, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "Security!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Get them out of here right now! Throw them out! They are trespassing!" From the corners of the massive room, 4 burly security guards wearing dark suits and earpieces began jogging toward us. They were moving fast, clearly intending to physically grab me and forcefully eject us from the venue. The wealthy guests at the surrounding tables gasped, pulling their chairs back to avoid the impending physical altercation. Megan, sitting 2 tables away, looked absolutely terrified, sinking lower into her chair as she realized her extortion victim was currently marching toward the stage, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. I did not stop walking. I pushed Ruby right up to the front of the room, stopping directly beside the small secondary podium used by the maitre d' to announce the dinner service. I engaged the heavy brakes on Ruby's chair, ensuring she was perfectly positioned center stage. The 4 security guards closed in, the lead guard reaching his hand out to grab my shoulder. I moved faster than him. I stepped behind the secondary podium, slammed my hand down on the microphone activation button, and grabbed the heavy metal mic from its stand. "Do not take another step toward this woman," I commanded, my voice booming through the massive surround sound speakers of the ballroom. The sheer volume and absolute authority in my tone caused all 4 security guards to stop dead in their tracks. Terrence grabbed his own microphone on the main stage. "I am the host of this event," he yelled, his face turning a violent shade of red. "I rented this ballroom. I am giving you a direct order to remove these women immediately. They are mentally unstable, and they are disrupting a private corporate function." I looked up at my husband, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. I brought the microphone closer to my mouth. "You did not rent anything, Terrence," I said, my voice echoing crystal clear off the high ceilings. "And these security guards do not work for you. They work for the property management group of the Magnolia Hotel. And the Magnolia Hotel is a subsidiary commercial asset entirely owned and operated by the Ruby Brooks Trust." The entire ballroom let out a collective audible gasp. Whispers immediately broke out among the tables of wealthy investors. I turned my attention directly to the lead security guard standing just 5 feet away from me. I pointed down at the stunning diamond-clad woman sitting quietly in her chair. "This is Ruby Brooks," I announced, making sure every single person in the room heard the name perfectly. "She is the sole beneficiary of that trust. She owns the ground you are standing on. She owns the roof over your head. She owns this entire building. If you lay a single hand on her or on me, her court-appointed financial manager, you will not just be fired. You will be prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law. Now step back and stand down." The lead security guard looked at me, looked at Ruby's terrifyingly calm demeanor, and then looked up at Terrence sweating profusely on the stage. The guard reached up, pressed his earpiece, and muttered a quick confirmation to his supervisor. He immediately took 3 steps backward, crossed his hands in front of his belt, and nodded respectfully to Ruby. The other 3 guards instantly followed his lead, forming a protective perimeter around us instead of removing us. Terrence was completely trapped. He stood frozen behind his podium, the bright stage lights illuminating the sheer terror pouring out of his pores. He had invited the wealthiest people in the city to watch him establish his empire. He had no idea he had just assembled the perfect audience to witness his absolute destruction. The standoff between the security team and Terrence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The wealthy donors and investors remained glued to their seats, their eyes darting rapidly between Terrence sweating on the main stage and the imposing diamond-draped figure of Grandma Ruby sitting perfectly still by the entrance. That was when Megan decided she needed to intervene. Megan had spent years desperately trying to secure her spot in this elite circle. She had mirrored Vivian's cruelty, worn the right designer labels, and parroted the right exclusionary rhetoric, all to ensure she was accepted by the affluent, predominantly white socialites seated at the tables around her. She saw this disruption not as a reckoning for the family's crimes, but as a direct threat to her own carefully curated public image. She could not stand the thought of her country club friends witnessing such an unrefined public dispute. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the marble floor, and marched toward me. Her face was flushed, but she pasted on a tight, patronizing smile designed to project an image of calm authority. "Kendra, please," Megan said, her voice dripping with that familiar, sickeningly sweet condescension as she approached the secondary podium. "You are making an absolute scene. This is a private corporate event, not a venue for your emotional outbursts. We all know you have been under an immense amount of stress lately, but behaving like a lunatic in front of Vivian's friends is completely unacceptable. You need to apologize to Terrence right now and wheel Ruby back to the service elevator before you embarrass yourself any further." I looked down at her. She was standing barely 3 feet away, reeking of expensive perfume and breathtaking hypocrisy. She was actually trying to play the polite peacekeeper. The very woman who just a few hours ago had tried to extort $100,000 from me in exchange for the financial passwords that would destroy her own mother-in-law. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her. I did not justify my presence or defend my mental state. I simply reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small remote presentation clicker. Earlier that afternoon, while the styling team was transforming Ruby, I had sent a courier to the Magnolia Hotel with a $5,000 cash envelope and a secure USB drive. The envelope was delivered directly to the head audiovisual technician running the control booth at the back of the grand ballroom. My instructions had been incredibly simple. When I give the signal, override the main presentation deck and mirror the files on the drive. I looked past Megan's flushed face, locking eyes with the technician standing behind the tinted glass of the control booth. I gave him a single definitive nod, and then I pressed the button on the clicker. Instantly, the massive 20-foot LED screen directly behind Terrence on the main stage went completely black. The sleek corporate logo for his fake tech startup vanished. A split second later, the screen illuminated with stark, blindingly bright white light. Projected in massive black font, large enough for every single person in the 200-capacity ballroom to read perfectly, was a high-resolution screenshot of a text message conversation. The entire ballroom gasped. It was not a quiet murmur. It was a sharp, collective intake of breath from hundreds of people simultaneously registering the sheer audacity of the words glowing above the stage. Megan froze. She turned her head slowly, her eyes tracking the massive screen. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a perfectly styled corpse. Right there for every major donor, every tech investor, and every high society snob in Atlanta to read were the exact text messages Megan had sent me. The timestamp was clearly visible. The contact name Megan Brooks was displayed prominently at the top. I have the keys to the kingdom. Vivian is careless. I downloaded her entire password vault onto a flash drive. I will give you everything you need to completely destroy her. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the massive projectors. Terrence spun around on the stage, staring up at the screen in pure disbelief. Vivian, still sitting at the VIP table below, clutched her chest, her eyes wide with shock as she realized the daughter-in-law she had groomed to be her perfect miniature clone had actively plotted to sell her out. I pressed the clicker a second time. The image on the screen shifted to the next slide in the text thread. $100,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency, transferred to my digital wallet by midnight. Once the transfer clears, I will send you the decryption key for the flash drive, and you can drain Vivian's offshore accounts dry. Megan let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She took a step backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting from table to table, searching for a friendly face, searching for anyone who would defend her. But there was no defense. She had confessed to felony extortion, corporate espionage, and a complete betrayal of the very family she claimed to represent, all in writing. Her country club friends, the women she had spent years desperately trying to impress, were staring at her with unvarnished disgust. They were whispering behind their hands, leaning away from her, as if her sudden social ruin was a contagious disease. But the most devastating reaction did not come from Vivian or Terrence. It came from the table Megan had just vacated. Her husband Terrence's younger brother stood up slowly. He had always been a quiet, passive man, entirely dominated by his mother's wealth and his wife's social climbing. But as he read the massive text messages proving that his own wife was actively trying to bankrupt his family and flee with a stolen fortune, the passivity vanished entirely. He stared at Megan. He did not yell. He did not cause a scene. He simply looked at her with a profound, soul-crushing revulsion. He shook his head once, threw his linen napkin onto the table, turned his back on her, and walked out of the ballroom through the side exit. He did not look back. Megan realized instantly what that meant. Her marriage was over. Her access to the family accounts was gone. Her standing in the elite circles of Atlanta society was completely and permanently eradicated. She had gambled everything on a ruthless extortion play, and I had just publicly executed her for it. She let out a choked, hysterical wail, turning and running from the ballroom, pushing past the security guards and disappearing into the lobby. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind her, sealing her exile. I turned my attention back to the main stage. Megan had been neutralized, but she was only a symptom of the disease. The real cancer was standing behind the podium. Terrence was hyperventilating. He looked at the massive text messages still glowing on the screen behind him, the words offshore accounts hanging over his head like a guillotine blade. He knew the investors sitting in the front rows were not stupid. They knew exactly what offshore accounts meant in the context of a tech startup that was bleeding cash. The murmurs in the room were growing louder, shifting from shock to anger. He looked down at me, his eyes wide, wild, and pleading. He was silently begging me to stop. He was begging me to spare him the final blow. But I had spent 5 years swallowing my pride to protect his fragile ego. I had spent the last 48 hours dealing with his cruelty, his forged eviction notices, and his willingness to let his own grandmother freeze to death. Mercy was no longer on the table. I picked up the heavy leather tote bag I had brought with me, the one containing a dozen glossy black binders filled with federal evidence. I unzipped the top, the sharp sound cutting through the rising tension in the room. I was ready to deliver the kill shot. I stood behind the secondary podium, my hand resting on the open zipper of the heavy leather tote bag, watching Vivian completely unravel. The pristine high society mask she had worn for decades was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. She slammed her hands down on the VIP table. The shattered glass of her dropped champagne flute crunched sharply under her palms, but she did not even seem to register the pain. She pushed her chair back violently and marched toward the center aisle, her silver sequined designer gown catching the harsh light of the chandeliers. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "You are a liar, Kendra," she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing with pure, unfiltered desperation. "You are a cheap blue-collar gold digger who orchestrated this entire circus because Terrence is finally divorcing you." Vivian turned wildly to the crowd, waving her arms frantically to the wealthy donors and investors who were now staring at her with wide, horrified eyes. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Vivian pleaded, her tone shifting rapidly from rage into a sickeningly sweet, desperate whine. "She has manipulated my mother-in-law's medical documents. She is trying to steal my family's legacy. I am the matriarch of the Brooks family. I built this charitable foundation. I own the estate. I control the wealth." The words had barely left Vivian's mouth when the sharp metallic click of the wheelchair brakes echoed through the deadly silent room. I stepped back, lowering my hands to my sides. Grandma Ruby placed both of her hands firmly on the armrests of her chair. She did not stumble. She did not hesitate or ask for my assistance. With absolute fluid grace, she pushed herself up and stood perfectly straight. The collective shock in the grand ballroom was an incredibly physical thing. Several women at the front tables actually gasped and recoiled in their seats. This was the woman Vivian had told everyone was entirely lost to severe dementia. This was the woman who was supposedly rotting away in a hospice bed, completely unaware of her own surroundings. Yet here she stood, a towering figure of undeniable elegance, wrapped in custom emerald silk and dripping in multi-carat vintage diamonds. She looked sharper, stronger, and more dangerous than anyone else in the building. Ruby reached out her hand. I handed her the heavy metal microphone. She did not need me to speak for her or defend her anymore. It was time for the queen to reclaim her throne. Ruby brought the microphone to her lips. Her voice boomed across the ballroom, amplified by the massive surround sound speakers. It was not the raspy, confused whisper Terrence and Vivian had grown accustomed to ignoring. It was a rich, articulate, and furious baritone that commanded absolute submission from every single person in the room. "You are a parasite, Vivian," Ruby announced, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. "You are a parasite who has spent the last 30 years feeding off a legacy my late husband and I built with our own 2 hands. You stand in front of these people tonight demanding respect as a matriarch. But a true matriarch protects her bloodline. You tried to erase yours." Ruby took a slow, deliberate step toward Vivian. She reached into the small beaded silk clutch hanging from her wrist and pulled out a crumpled piece of yellow paper. She held it up high for the entire room to see. 2 days ago, your brilliant son and you flew to Cabo San Lucas to drink margaritas on a beach. Ruby continued, her tone dripping with lethal precision. Before you left, Terrence wrote this post-it note to Kendra. It says, "Deal with this senile old woman. Do not call us." The disgust in the room was immediate and vocal. The wealthy donors who had spent years applauding Vivian's fake charitable endeavors and writing massive checks for her foundation were now looking at her like she was covered in toxic waste. Elder abuse was not a scandal you could spin with a public relations firm. Ruby's eyes swept across the faces of the investors seated at the front tables. "They locked me in a guest bedroom with no heating in the middle of November," Ruby said, ensuring every word landed like a physical blow. "They cut off the thermostat. They left me in a soiled nightgown with no food and no water, hoping the freezing temperatures would stop my heart before they returned from their luxury vacation. They did it because they thought they had successfully drained my local bank accounts, and I was no longer a useful source of income." On the main stage, Terrence actually took a step backward, bumping hard against the large acrylic podium. The arrogant tech CEO was reduced to a trembling, sweating child, entirely paralyzed by the exposure of his monstrous cruelty. Vivian took a step backward, shaking her head frantically, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place. "No," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper against the heavy silence of the crowd. "That is a lie. You are sick, Ruby. Your mind is completely gone." Ruby closed the distance between them until she was standing less than 2 feet away from her daughter-in-law. She looked down at Vivian with a gaze so incredibly cold it could have frozen the entire ballroom. She leaned slightly forward, speaking directly into the microphone so her final verdict would be immortalized in the minds of everyone present. "You don't own a damn thing," Vivian Ruby stated, her voice dropping into a deadly echoing register. "Not this hotel, not the mansion you live in, not even the sequined dress on your back. It was all bought with my money." The absolute silence that followed Ruby's declaration shattered the second Terrence finally realized he was trapped. The arrogant tech chief executive officer, the man who had spent his entire adult life believing he was untouchable, suddenly broke. He dropped his microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, painful feedback screech that made half the room cover their ears. He turned away from the crowd, frantically scanning the shadows behind the stage for an exit. He practically tripped over the clear acrylic podium, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished wood as he made a desperate, pathetic dash for the rear service doors. I did not yell for security to stop him. I did not even flinch. I calmly stepped forward and unzipped the heavy leather tote bag I had carried down the center aisle. I pulled out the first glossy black presentation binder and dropped it squarely onto the table in front of the lead investor for Terrence's startup. The heavy binder hit the marble tabletop with a solid, echoing thud. I pulled out another binder and handed it to the chairman of Vivian's charitable foundation. I moved methodically from table to table, distributing the flawless forensic dossiers directly into the hands of the most powerful people in Atlanta. "My husband is currently trying to escape through the kitchen," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the chaotic ballroom without the need for a microphone. "But he will not get very far. I strongly suggest you all open those folders. Inside, you will find the absolute truth about the man you were just preparing to give your money to." The lead investor ripped open the cover of his binder. His eyes darted across the highlighted bank ledgers and the forged property deeds. "You are currently funding a textbook Ponzi scheme," I explained, pacing slowly in front of the stage as the wealthy donors began crowding around the open binders. "Terrence Brooks has zero actual software development. He has no functional product. He used a $5 million commercial loan secured by forging his grandmother's signature and stealing the deed to her estate to artificially inflate his corporate value. He took your capital, washed it through a series of shell companies, and funneled $8.5 million straight into a Cayman Islands offshore account registered under his mother's name." The ballroom erupted. The sophisticated, polite atmosphere completely evaporated, replaced by the furious shouting of billionaires who had just realized they had been played for absolute fools. Men in expensive tuxedos were slamming their fists on the tables. Women were shoving their chairs back, demanding answers. Vivian tried to intervene. She lunged forward desperately, trying to snatch one of the open binders from the hands of a foundation board member. "You cannot look at that!" she shrieked, her voice cracking in pure panic. "It is fabricated. She printed fake documents to ruin us." The board member, a woman who had been Vivian's closest country club ally for over a decade, snatched the folder out of Vivian's reach. She looked at Vivian with utter disgust. "Your signature is right here next to the forged notary stamp," Vivian, the woman spat. "You stole from your own mother-in-law to steal from us. You are absolutely repulsive." Vivian stumbled backward, her legs giving out. She collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands, as the sheer magnitude of her ruin crashed down on her. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany double doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open once again. A team of 12 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across the back marched into the room. They were flanked by uniformed police officers who immediately secured all the exits. I had spent 4 hours that morning sitting in a secure conference room at the federal building, walking the lead investigator through every single page of my dossier. They had been waiting in the hotel lobby for my signal. A pair of agents emerged from the back hallway leading to the kitchen. They were holding Terrence. His hands were violently yanked behind his back and secured with heavy steel handcuffs. His custom-tailored suit was torn at the shoulder from where he had clearly tried to physically fight his way past them. His face was pale, covered in sweat, and completely stripped of his signature arrogance. The lead federal agent stepped into the center of the ballroom, holding up a federal warrant. "Terrence Brooks and Vivian Brooks," he announced, his authoritative voice easily cutting through the shouting crowd. "You are both under arrest for federal bank fraud, wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit money laundering." Terrence did not look at the investors. He did not look at his mother. He looked directly at me. As the federal agents dragged him toward the exit, our eyes locked for one final second. He finally understood that the woman he had treated like an uneducated servant for 5 years was the architect of his absolute destruction. I did not smile. I simply turned my back on him and walked over to Grandma Ruby. Vivian was pulled out of her chair by a female officer. She kicked and screamed, her silver-sequined designer gown tangling around her legs as they locked the handcuffs around her wrists. She wailed hysterically, begging her wealthy friends to call their lawyers, begging anyone to help her. Not a single person stepped forward. The elite society she had worshipped completely turned their backs on her, watching in silent judgment as she was paraded out of the ballroom in absolute disgrace. 3 months have passed since the night the Brooks family empire burned to the ground. The dust has finally settled over Atlanta, leaving an entirely new landscape in its wake. I am sitting on the massive sun-drenched terrace of Grandma Ruby's sprawling estate. The morning air is crisp, and the manicured gardens are quiet and peaceful. There are no fake charity galas to plan. There are no toxic family dinners to endure. Terrence is currently sitting in a federal detention center. Because I provided the authorities with the exact routing numbers to his offshore accounts, the judge deemed him an extreme flight risk and completely denied his bail. He is facing a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. The Securities and Exchange Commission seized every single asset connected to his fake tech company, liquidating his luxury cars and freezing his bank accounts to slowly pay back the investors he defrauded. Vivian was formally evicted from this mansion exactly 48 hours after her arrest. The bank accounts she relied on to fund her lavish lifestyle were seized as evidence of money laundering. Because she has absolutely no marketable skills and no actual wealth of her own, she is currently awaiting her own federal trial while living in a cramped, incredibly cheap one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her country club membership was revoked. Her foundation board officially expelled her. She is a social ghost, entirely shunned by the people she spent her entire life trying to impress. Megan suffered her own brutal downfall. Her husband filed for an expedited divorce the morning after the gala, citing irreconcilable differences and completely cutting her out of the family trust. Without the Brooks family name to protect her, her wealthy friends dropped her instantly. She was forced to move out of her luxury suburban home and is currently working a menial retail job just to pay the rent on a small studio apartment. As for me, my divorce from Terrence was finalized with breathtaking speed. Because of his felony fraud convictions, the post-nuptial agreement he forced me to sign was completely invalidated by the court. My legal team tore his remaining legitimate assets apart, securing my rightful half of the marital estate. But I am not relying on a divorce settlement to build my future. I officially resigned from my corporate auditing firm last month. Grandma Ruby hired me as the official wealth manager for her $45 million trust. I draw a massive, fully legitimate salary to manage her portfolio, ensure her investments are secure, and protect her legacy from any remaining vultures. We live together in the mansion Vivian tried so desperately to steal. We drink our morning coffee on the terrace, we laugh, and we enjoy the absolute peace that comes from removing toxic people from our lives. I take a slow sip of my coffee, looking out over the sprawling green lawns of the estate. The sun is warm against my face. The journey from that freezing guest bedroom to this peaceful terrace was the hardest fight of my life, but it was absolutely worth it. If you take anything away from my story, let it be this. Never let entitled people make you feel small. Never let anyone convince you that your background makes you less valuable than their unearned privilege. Stand your ground, document everything, and never ever underestimate a woman who knows how to count the receipts. Have you ever had to strategically dismantle a toxic person in your life? How did you secure your own justice? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of ultimate vindication. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that the truth always comes to light and that karma is best served with a flawless paper trail. Thank you for watching, and remember to always know your worth.